I'm going to record this if that's okay for the folks who can't make it. Um, so, a word of introduction about the Zohar. Um, the Zohar is a description of the inner life and workings of God, but it's an inclusive version of God that includes Mikomo Shel Olam. He is the place of the world. So it's the whole world. It's about how God is constantly emanating, energizing, recreating the world each second anew. And it's about getting into the finer points of that flow of energy. That's what the Zohar is all about. And in doing that, it's not just a study. The Zohar hopes that we'll get caught up through the text and use it like a doorway or a gateway to enter into and become a part of that dynamic process by which God is constantly recreating the world. Does that make sense? And so the Zohar isn't just kind of study when we study the Zohar. The Zohar, in its own mind, if it has a mind, it's obviously a collection of texts, but it seeks to be more than study. It's a mystical experience, and the mystical experience is very much tied up in the poetry of it. That's going to be very important for today's lesson. Um, Many of the lessons we dealt with in the past were really about the Sfirot, about the 10 Sfirot and how they interact with each other and what that corresponds to in our world or in the history of the Jewish people, right? And so we talked about what does Abraham mean cosmically, right? And what does it mean that God created? And we talked about Bereshit, as you may remember as Barashit, that God created 6 of the Sfirot and sort of different emanations. Today, we're going to do a different thing. The Zohar, sometimes after teachings, goes on to talk about the act of Torah study itself. So, like, someone will make a profound point in the Zohar, and the Zohar is Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and his Chevraya, as it's referred to, his clan, his squad. Is that how the millennials call it? So, it's his group of people, the Tanaim, who lived around him, Rabbi Chia and Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Elazar bar Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Elazar the son of Rabbi Shimon, and others. These people, Rabbi Yehuda, the people who were Tanaim at the time of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, become the characters in the Zohar. Now, there's a lot of ink spilled academically, whatever, but who actually wrote the Zohar? Was it? How did it get transmitted? How did? We're not going to really deal with that in this class. There's enough people that dealt with that. We're just interested in it. We accept that however it came to be, it is the classic work of Jewish Kabbalah, and we're gonna benefit from it however it got on the page. So, just I guess one final piece. Um, Today's teaching is in the framework of when you study Torah, you're not just studying Torah. That's the summary of today's teaching. And now we're going to get into what happens when so it's kind of a meta lesson, like what happens when we study the Zohar, or what could happen. And it's going to offer the examples of Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Chia in particular, and what happened, death, life, in heaven, angels, and it's going to get very mystical and fantastical and legendary. So that's enough of a preview, I think. So we'll jump into it. I'm going to share the texts with you in a moment. Yes. Any questions or comments before we start?
No. Go for it.
Now this will be good, because we're also doing these parshios as Bereshis is happening. You know, we're in Sefer Bereshis, so it's a good time. Oh. Okay, and now you see the Zohar? Is that
Right.
You see the Zohar. This is good. Okay. Okay. So we're going to start here. And the way we'll do this is we're going to read it in the Aramaic, and then we're going to use Daniel Matt's translation. People may know Daniel Matt, the great professor of Jewish mysticism, along with many others, Joel Hecker and others, has put together a complete study translation of the Zohar. That's English with notes. It's a phenomenal edition. So we'll use that for the English, and I will copy that, but I can also email it to people in advance if you want, or you can purchase volume 1, but I'll switch back and forth between this Aramaic text and that. Okay, so Ishtatach Rabbi Chia be'ara uneshak la'afra, uvechava amar afra afra, kama at kashe kedal, kama at bachatzifu, dechol machmade ena yizbalun bach, kol amudei nahorin da'ama techu v'teduk. Kama at chatzifa, botzina kadisha, tahava nahir alma, shalita ravira mimana dizchute mekayim alma itblebach. Rabbi Shimon nihiru devutzina, nihiru de alma at vale ba'afra va'ant kayim v'nahig alma. Ishtomem riga chada va'amar afra, afra. Latit gai delayit masrun bach amudin de alma, daha Rabbi Shimon lo itblebach. So I read it, I know it's a lot to digest in Aramaic. I just toggle between the two, but I want you to have the Aramaic. I know it's not anyone's first language. Rabbi Chia prostrated himself on the ground, kissing the dust and weeping. He cried out. Dust. Did the share switch? Do you see the Aramaic or?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. Aramaic or English?
No. We see the English, just the English, right?
Okay. So Rabbi Chia puts himself on the ground. Rabbi Shimon has just given a beautiful teaching about Bereshis and what it means. It's a long, complicated thing. It was like we spent the whole last year on it. And so Rabbi Chia says in response to that, he bows on the ground, kissing the dust and weeping. He cries out, dust, dust, how stubborn are you? How impudent. All delights of the eye, machmadei enaz, the Zohar calls it, decay in you. All pillars of light, Butzina Kadisha. Now, Butzina Kadisha is a holy lamp, and this term is the term the Zohar uses for Rabbi Shimon, is Butzina Kadisha, the holy lamp. That's how the Zohar calls Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. All pillars of light in the world you consume and pulverize. How insolent you are. The holy lamp, Rabbi Shimon, who has illumined the world, majestic ruler, prince whose merit sustains the world, decays in you. O Rabbi Shimon, radiance of the lamp, radiance of the worlds, you decompose in the dust, yet you subsist and guide the world. So we have this teaching. Rabbi Chia, here's a beautiful teaching from Rabbi Shimon, and he's crushed. One day Rabbi Shimon's going to die. How could this be? It's such an incredible... And so we're really dealing now, actually, with the death scene. We've kind of like jumped. So the Zohar is kind of not in a place and time. So, we don't know exactly if Rabbi Chia is kind of having this bittersweet recognition that one day it's going to end, or maybe it's already over. Like maybe we're now jumping to the deathbed scene of Rabbi Shimon, and this is how the students react, which is how many commentators understand it. But however it is, so Rabbi Chia is lying on the ground and he's saying that it's really a shame, it's a tragedy that Rabbi Shimon is going to decay in the dust. It says more though, that he has illumined the world. He is a majestic ruler, so he's in charge. He's a prince whose merit sustains the world. Now remember, prince is a funny language. Rabbi Shimon was revolting against the Roman Empire. So he's not like he's the real royalty, even though there's royalty in Rome, but he's the real royalty, and his merit sustains the world. So there's a sense in the Zohar framework that the Sadiq, the righteous person, is the person who is able to capture divine flow and bring it into the world. And it's for that sake that the world exists. You decompose in the dust, and yet you subsist and guide the world. But even after he decomposes, there's this sense that Rabbi Shimon is going to still guide the world. The footnote here says, the soul of Rabbi Shimon endures in the Garden of Eden, and his spiritual power still guides the world. So I just wanted to pause here because this notion, I think, is prominent in the Kabbalah, but like foreign to other streams of Judaism. The idea that the tzaddik, even after they die, their merit still does all kinds of things to sustain the world. Like some people consider that a little Christian, but I think with the popularization of like Hasidic thinking, maybe that's actually, maybe you're like, of course, or maybe you're like, how Christian that sounds, or maybe, I don't know. So I'm looking at like, how does this teaching, that Rabbi Shimon, even after he dies, but he's able to influence the world from the Garden of Eden. Do you have a reaction to that? You don't have to, but.
Well, I mean, I don't know if I would make the exact same correlation, but someone like Shakespeare, who's been dead for hundreds and hundreds of years, still in a way, influences things in people and the way they look at life and the way they read literature. So I think great people who leave their mark certainly can have a profound influence on groups of people, individuals. Maybe is that too simple? I mean, is that like
no? So you're talking like naturalistically, right? In other words, like yesterday I was complaining about something, and someone said to me in jest, but frankly, the lady doth protest too much. And I knew that they were accusing me of hypocrisy by quoting good old Bill Shakespeare. And so, and immediately, they were right? Like, what can I say in response to that? So,
but maybe something a little bit deeper, in terms of, the influence of philosopher, that besides just using a quote that kind of fits the situation, something a little bit deeper than that.
So right. I mean, I guess it's true. And to the extent that what you're saying, Marvin, is that even, so the question is, how deep do you want to make that? And if you're willing to say deeper, like metaphysical, like beyond the natural course of things, but even in sort of deep spiritual channels that operate, then yeah, that's what they're saying, right? Is that, the influence of a person, and particularly of an important or significant or a holy person, really lives on, well beyond.
Right. Some people will say that, well, like the Rabbi, people will say, well, sometimes you can take a little bit too far and treat it as if he, never really did pass on. And that's a whole different madrega, so to speak. I'm not talking about that.
Right. So the question is, right, where, and I guess this is what I'm driving at, where's the line between, someone redeems the world, saves the world even after their death, and someone continues to have a profound influence, right? There's like a fine line between a kind of after-death messianic worship, and the Zohar gets close to that line. It gets close. So we then read on. For a moment, he was shocked. We had read this as well, and then exclaimed, "Dust, dust." So what was he shocked about? Like, he prostrates on the ground and he lets this thing out, and he's shocked at what he said. So there's an interesting thing, right? This is like an excited utterance in the law, right? Admissible hearsay. This just comes out of Rabbi Chia. He doesn't plan this speech. And so he was shocked, and then he exclaimed, "Dust, dust, do not boast. The pillars of the world will not be surrendered to you. Rabbi Shimon has not decayed in you." Right? So, dust. You might get excited and think that like you have these great righteous people in you. And so you're all that, right? All that Moses is in the dust, right? You know, the greats lie in the dust. So he says, don't think so much of yourself. Rabbi Shimon hasn't decayed. So this is a riff off of a Talmudic tradition that is mentioned in the Gemara. The Gemara in Bava Metzia, HaSocher HaSapolim, the chapter dealing with work and wage laws, has a long discussion of Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shimon there, and it discusses their body mass and other things. And there it says that righteous don't decay. And so this is the spiritual version of that teaching, right? That righteous people might actually not degrade in the dust. There's something about the spiritual essence of the people that causes their physical bodies to continue to manifest even after death. Okay, let me switch back to the Hebrew. Kam Rabbi Chia v'hava bachi, azo Rabbi Yossi imei. Me'ahu yoma itane arba'in yomin lemechme leRabbi Shimon. Amru le, leit antrashai lemechme le. V'chavi itani arba'in yomin acharinin. Achazil le bechezva leRabbi Shimon v'Rabbi Elazar brei. Tahavu alan b'mila da amar Rabbi Yossi. Kama altin saitin lemilule. Adahachi chama kama gadfin rabber vinilain usaliku alayhu Rabbi Shimon v'Rabbi Elazar brei usaliku lemitivta dirakia. V'chol ilin gadfin havu mechakam lehu chama demithadran umithchadshan dezivon unihir yatir min ahora deziva deshimsha. So we have this scene. Still weeping, Rabbi Chia rose and walked on together with Rabbi Yossi from that day on. He fasted. So we have Rabbi Chia and Rabbi Yossi, the two of the leading students of Rabbi Shimon. And from the day of his death on, they fast 40 days to see Rabbi Shimon. And the idea of fasting 40 days to have a revelation is a note. What's the classic example of fasting 40 days to have a revelation? Do you think of fasting 40 days to have a revelation? We think Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe fasted lachem lo achalti umayim lo shasisi. Right? Moshe Rabbeinu didn't eat for 40 days and he didn't drink for 40 days. And so here, though, note the change. Rabbi Chia and Rabbi Yossi reenacting what Moshe did, fast for 40 days. Not to experience the revelation from Hashem, but to be able to re-experience the teaching of Rabbi Shimon. And so in this version of it, by doing that, Rabbi Shimon becomes, I don't want to say godlike, maybe that's a bit much, but it's Moshe and Rabbi Chia and Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Shimon, it all kind of merges together in the story. So they fast for 40 days. To try and have a vision of Rabbi Shimon. He was told, so now we don't know who he is. Is it Rabbi Chia? Is it Rabbi Yossi? Two of them. You are not entitled, it's Rabbi Chia probably. You're not entitled to see him. So they fast for 40 days to try and see Rabbi Shimon, and when they do it, they're told. Told by who? Told by a voice, a heavenly voice. You can't see Rabbi Shimon. So the story is Rabbi Shimon died, and Rabbi Chia and Rabbi Yossi are crushed. Rabbi Chia fasts for 40 days, maybe Rabbi Yossi too, in order to see Rabbi Shimon. And after 40 days of fasting, Rabbi Chia is told by a heavenly voice, no, you do not get to see Rabbi Shimon. So he wept and fasted another 40 days. In a vision, he was shown Rabbi Shimon and his son, Rabbi Elazar, studying the word that Rabbi Yossi had spoken. Now, the footnote here notes, Rabbi Yossi had transmitted a teaching of Rabbi Shimon's concerning Bereshis Bara that we had studied earlier. So this is on Parshas Bereshis. So they're studying Rabbi Shimon on Parshas Bereshis. So what happens? Rabbi Chia gets there, and Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Elazar are studying Rabbi Yossi's transmission of the teaching of Rabbi Shimon. So like they're up there studying their students' take on his teaching. So he gives a teaching over to his students. His students then give that teaching over. He's in heaven and he's studying the way his students interpreted his teaching. That's what's going on. This has a reminiscence of Moshe Rabbeinu, the famous story about Moshe and Rabbi Akiva, that in the Gemara, that Moshe is in Shemayim, and he is there, and Rabbi Akiva says that something is halacha Moshe misinai, and God comes to Moshe Rabbeinu and shows him this vision to, make him happy and see that it passed on. And Moshe has no idea where this came from, right? But still, it's attributed to him. So there's this version of that here. Again, the Moshe Rabbeinu theme, fasting for 40 days. His students are transmitting a teaching, perhaps in different ways. And so that's what Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Elazar are studying, the word that Rabbi Yossi had spoken about Rabbi Shimon's teaching, with thousands listening. Meanwhile, he noticed many huge celestial wings, right? So there are angels all over this heavenly base medrash. It's full of angels, with which Rabbi Shimon and his son Rabbi Elazar mounted, and they go on the wings of the angels, and they soar to the academy of heaven. So these things that they're teaching cause them to soar. So now we're saying something about the words of the Zohar. The words of the Zohar are like wings of angels, but maybe they're not like wings of angels. They are wings of angels. And these words, when they are taught, cause those that study them to soar, not from the base medrash dilatata below to the base medrash of dilaela, of above. And so Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Elazar soar to the academy of heaven, what they call here the academy in the rakia, in the heavens. All those wings waited for them. He saw them returning, their splendor renewed, and they shone more brilliantly than the dazzle of the sun. So you have these wings, and these wings are glowing. You can picture it. Everywhere, thousands of wings of angels that have carried them to heaven, glowing like stars in the sun with the words of the Zohar. Of course, Zohar means brilliance or radiance or shining. And so that's part of why these things, that's part of why this book shines. So the Zohar is doing what it does often. It talks about itself. It reflects on its own, why is it the Zohar? So the Zohar is almost saying, why is this Sefer called Sefer HaZohar? Because the teachings shine like the wings of angels that carry you to heaven when you study the teachings well. Okay. There's kind of a lot of layers here. I think the other layer underneath this all is, of course, that Rabbi Shimon is studying his own teaching that is being interpreted in a chain. So there's also something about the chain of transmission of Kabbalah that's being reflected here and being compared to the transmission of Moshe Rabbeinu. Pasach Rabbi Shimon va'amar. Rabbi Shimon opened and says, so now that Rabbi Shimon is here in the academy on high after the wings have transported him and his son Rabbi Elazar after studying the teaching that Rabbi Yossi transmitted in their name, va'amar. Ye'ul Rabbi Achia v'lachne b'chama dezamin kutshabrichu v'chadata anfei tzadikaya l'simna da'asi. Zaka yuman al hacha below kisufa, v'zaka man kayim bahu alma ka'amuda takif bechola. V'chama dahava al v'hava kam Rabbi Elazar sharmutin diyasvin taman v'hu hava ksif ba'ashmit garme va'al v'yasiv l'ragloi de Rabbi Shimon. So the story goes on, and interrupt with a question or comment at any point. Rabbi Chia saw himself. Rabbi Shimon opened, saying, so he says the following thing: let Rabbi Chia enter and see how the Blessed Holy One, Kadosh Baruch Hu, intends to rejuvenate the faces of the righteous in the world to come. So a lot of the teachings of the Zohar reflect midrashic teachings. So this one, the footnote notes, is also found in Kohelet Rabbah, in the Midrash Rabbah on Koheles, on Ecclesiastes. Rabbi Yirmiyah, the son of Rabbi Elazar, says, so there is a different authorship chain, but in the time to come, the Kadosh Baruch Hu, the Blessed Holy One, will rejuvenate the light of the faces of the righteous, as it is said but may those that love him be as the sun going forth in its might. So there's an idea here, right, that a face has a countenance, that a face that's alive has and the energy of a person is in their face. And so, but when you've passed away, your face has no expression, right? It's just, that's where you see it. So, but there's this idea that in the world to come, the righteous will have their faces, even in death, like they're alive. Happy is one who enters here without shame. Happy is one who stands in that world as a sturdy pillar. So there's this interesting tension that's going to go on. Rabbi Shimon isn't alive, and Rabbi Chia is alive. So can Rabbi Chia, who's trying to see Rabbi Shimon, like, they're in different worlds, you know what I mean? So what is the possibility of this text, of these teachings of Kabbalah, of Torah, to draw us between, to transcend death and life, to connect us to people even after they're dead through the teachings? That's the question. How can the Torah help us transcend? So the issue is, happy is one who enters here without shame. If you can enter the academy on high without shame, the shame of sin or not being worthy, that's great. But also, it's good to stay in the world. You know, it's better to live than be dead, because you can do mitzvahs here, right? As we say it in the Psalm, in the Hallel, Lo ha-mesim hallelujah, right? Dead. After you're dead, you can't praise God. So it all happens here, on the one hand. So Rabbi Shimon's back and forth here. Oh, okay. So I think we read a little more. Rabbi Chia saw himself entering. Rabbi Elazar rose together with the pillar sitting there. Embarrassed, he drew back and then sat at the feet of Rabbi Shimon. So Rabbi Chia, after 80 days of fasting, a failed attempt and then a second attempt, makes it there. And he's sitting at the feet of Rabbi Elazar and the others. Rabbi Chia is embarrassed, and he sits at the feet of Rabbi Shimon. And that's the scene. Now we go back to our Aramaic text here. Kala nafak va'amar ma'ich enach. Lo tiskof reshach v'lo tistakal. Ma'ich enoi v'chama nahora tahava nahir lemerachok. Kala ahadar kemilakad min va'amar ilayin tmirin stimin pekicha ena inun dimishatatin b'chol alma istakalu v'chamu. Tatain dimichin setimin v'choraichun itaru. A voice sounded, nafak, issued, as they translated here. Lower your eyes, do not raise your head, do not gaze. Lowering his eyes, he saw light shining in the distance. The voice returned. Oh, high, hidden, concealed ones, setimin, open-eyed, roaming the entire world, gaze and see. Oh, low sleeping ones, close-eyed, awake. So there are two commands that issue here. So Rabbi Chia is told to not look up, to keep his eyes closed. I don't know where I've gone here. I messed up the text. Hold on. Okay, so the voice then says, high hidden concealed ones. Who are the high hidden concealed ones? Roaming the entire world? These are either angels or maybe they are tzaddikim who have passed away. Like, so souls of righteous people are angels. So this voice says to the angels, let's just say, who are around, who are described in these lofty terms, gaze and see. Look at what we're about to say. Oh, lo, sleeping ones, close-eyed. These are people. People are like asleep. Why are we asleep? So we don't recognize the reality of things. We're lost in our dreamlike world, our beds of life. We get stuck in what's happening. We're here. And so therefore, we're like asleep. Our eyes are closed. Awake. See through reality. Okay, so this is just like the introduction, like Moshe saying, "Ha'azinu hashamayim va'adaber v'tishma artzim refi." Angels, listen up. People who are like zombies, I've got something for you. So what's the teaching? Man minchon di chashocha nahafchem lenahora v'ta'amin merira lemitka advayetunacha. Man minachon dimechakan b'chol yoma lenahora denahir b'shaita demalka pakid le'ayalta v'it yakar v'it krei malka mikol malchin da'alma. Man de lo mitzapeta b'chol yoma b'hu alma leit le'chulaka hacha. Now we're at the kind of the meat of the teaching here. The whole introduction story is to get everyone in heaven with the angels and Rabbi Chia there with Rabbi Shimon so that this teaching can happen. Okay, so we have a little more. Who among you turns darkness into light, bitter into sweet before arriving here? Before arriving here, this means who among you acts correctly in the world such that before you die and come to heaven, you transform things a bit. Who among you awaits each day the light that shines when the king visits the doe and is glorified, declared king of all kings of the world? Whoever does not await this each day in the world has no chilek, no chulaka hacha, no portion in the worlds to come. In lo chilek l'olam haba. This is a riff on the Gemara, which says that there are a couple of things which they ask you upon your entrance examination when we end our days here. It should be after 120 for everyone on the Zoom. So when that happens, what do they ask you? It's a famous Gemara. People know. Anyone know what are some of the things they ask you? I missed that. I got a call which interrupted in my headphones. Did anyone say anything?
No.
So one of them, is, did you do your business honestly? Did you engage honestly in business, or did you cheat? Another is, kavati timla Torah. Did you set aside time for the study of Torah? At least today, the answer for all of us is yes. And the final question, one of the others that they ask is, Tzipita Yeshua, did you await, did you anticipate the redemption? Did you eagerly await the redemption? So it's an important thing actually, just while we're here on Tzipita Yeshua, did you await the redemption? My teacher at Yeshiva University, Rabbi David Horowitz, said that people frequently misunderstand the Rambam's Ikar about this. One of the Rambam's 13 Ikarim, this is a side point, it's nothing to do with the Zohar per se, is that I like to repeat anytime I can kind of common misnomers. So I think a lot of people think, I used to think, that what this meant really, or what the Ikar meant, that, B'chal Yom, every day you should be awaiting the Messiah, right? This notion. How do they express it? On Nima Mim B'Muna Shlema B'Viyat HaMashiach V'Alpishit Mamein Kozeh Chakal B'Chol Yom She'avo. How the song goes, right?
Yeah.
So I'll wait every day that he should come. I used to think that meant that I had to expect that the Messiah could come at any moment. In other words, real faith meant the Messiah could come now, and I got to be ready, suitcase packed under the bed to get out of here and go. But really, if you read what the Rambam writes about it, which the song is meant to be a summary of, he doesn't say, in fact, he says you shouldn't expect the Messiah to come at any time. There are times that make sense and times that it's not going to be surprise here. That's not how it works. but rather what it means is that at every moment you should be desiring that it happens. Not that you need to desire that it happens at that moment, but you should always want that thing to be happening. In other words, you don't have to expect that even with all the problems in the world, suddenly Messianic redemption is going to happen in an hour. But you do have to want that it should happen in an hour, even if it's unrealistic. You see, so that's a different, just understand the difference. It's, in any event, Rabbi Horowitz kind of stressed that. So here, this is a mystical redo of that, because we're talking about entering heaven, and what happens entering heaven, a version, a translation of Tzipiti Yeshua, but in Zohar language. So it says, who among you awaits each day the light that shines? There's this great light that happens when the king visits the dough. Now the dough is Shekhinah, and you may remember our Sphirot chart, but if you don't, we have the Sphirot here up again. Yeah. So these are the Sphirot, the diagram of God's emanation. And the king here is, probably symbolized by Kadosh Baruch Hu, which is Chesed Gvura Tiferet Netzach Hod Yesod, this whole thing. When the king visits the dough, when God's presence comes and deals with Israel, or the real world, or the exile. The state of God's presence in the world now is one of exile. And so when the king visits the dough, when God visits his people, when God roams in the world, when God deals with the state of reality as it is, which is one of profound exile. How do I? Sorry, I'm making you dizzy, I'm sure. Okay, so and is glorified, declared King of all kings of the world. Whoever does not await this each day in the world has no portion here. So we have this notion that there's a time every day when God takes stock of the exile, when God, so Ezekiel, people know Ezekiel, the beginning of Yechezkel. What happens? We read it on Shavuos morning, the time when everyone's following the Haftorah very carefully. And so that time, it's the first chapter. Ezekiel sees God, Kimare Adam, looking like a person, on a chariot, a Merkava, that's hightailing it out of here with angels on all sides. And what that represents is that God is moving into exile. Yechezkel is one of the only Nevi'im to prophesy not in the land of Israel. So God is leaving with the people and leaving the land into the exile. But here that takes on a deeper thing. God empathizes. God suffers too with the people. And so when God is doing this, if we await the redemption, our awaiting the redemption meets the action of God, where God is taking pity on the exile, which we caused, mind you, through our own, it's our misdeeds which cause it. But still, when we kind of say, I wish it weren't so, and we have both the regret that comes with how we got here, but also the optimistic hope of redemptive possibility, and we say, I wish it could be this perfect world where divine presence is manifest and things are as they should be, we're mirroring what God is doing, which is he's having the same feelings from his end. And we meet. And that's how you have a portion there, right? So that's pining, feeling the loss and hoping for it not to be, is actually how you meet God in this. That's this teaching, which issues. Goes on. Adahachi chama min chavraya sachrane kol inun amudin dekayamim. V'chama dislikulon limitivta derekia ilain salkin v'ilain nachatin. Ve'ela dekulu chama mari degadfe da'ava'ate v'hu ome oma deshama me'acharei pargoda demalka mafkad b'chol yoma dechir la'ayalta dishchivat la'afro v'at v'itin bahushata b'tlat ma'a v'tishin rekian v'kulu miratatin v'zayin. Okay, so now we have a little gematria that occurs. Meanwhile, he noticed many of the chevraya, the companions, the chevra, surrounding all those erect pillars. And he saw them being raised to the academy of heaven, some ascending and some descending. What's here the action of Ratzo V'Shov, Olim V'Yordim. People are approaching heaven. He sees the Tanayim, the members of Rabbi Shimon's chevra, and as this is occurring, some of them are ascending to heaven, which means they're engaged as they're ascending in this action of hoping for redemption, and then descending, which is the secret of our religious life in the Zohar. It's a constant game of inspiration and then coming back. And I'll add, Rabbi Nachman of Breslov says all the time, you should be baki b'ratzo, baki b'shov. You have to be an expert in religious inspiration and ascending, and you also have to be an expert in shov and coming down in religious non-inspiration. Like you shouldn't be addicted. So this is a comment about the youngins, myself included. People today are sometimes addicted to spiritual inspiration. So that, even in the subtle language of the Zohar, isn't how it is. Religious life is full of inspiration or ascending, but then it's also full of always descent. No one lives always in heaven. And as Rabbi Nachman says, you can't force it. You can't force it. It happens, and you have to accept moments of inspiration and be ready to embrace them, and also accept moments of deceleration and be ready to embrace kind of the in-between. Okay, that's a side point. There are side points always. I apologize. So what happens here? He noticed many of the companions surrounding all those erect pillars. He saw them being raised to the academy of heaven, some ascending, some descending. Above them all, he saw Mare de Gadfe, the master of wings. The master of wings is who? The master of wings is Metatron. Are you familiar with Metatron? So one of the things that will happen as we do the Zohar a little bit is we're going to get acquainted with the angels, but not just the angels as a category, with particular angels. And so Metatron is there are two angels in particular that occupy kind of prominent places in the more prominent places, Metatron and Sandalphon. And they may be represented by Chanoch and Eliyahu, respectively, the two biblical figures who ascend to heaven, as it were, and kind of take on this angelic place. And they're related to each other. They're like Sandalphon, maybe like a lower expression of the other. And actually, it is important to note, even here, that at a bris milah, so a lot of this stuff made it into Jewish practice. So people are familiar with this idea that at a bris milah, Eliyahu is present. And that's because Eliyahu there is an embodiment of the Malach, one of the chief angels, Sandalphon, who is in charge of bestowing souls on Jewish people, and really endowing them with a soul, which happens in a certain sense at the bris, where the child enters the covenant, the male child. So that's actually why there's a sandak. People know the sandak, is a role at the bris, but sandak is actually an acronym for the Sandalphon Kisei, the chair of Sandalphon, which became the Kisei Shel Eliyahu because Eliyahu was associated with Sandalphon. But the Sandak's the person that sits in Elijah's chair, but it's because they're channeling Sandalphon, the angel, San, who gives the soul. In any event, so these things, they're like in the book, but they took on, for many Jews, when the Zohar was more commonly studied and became a big deal, like the things became naming rights for the rituals and influenced even how we do things. Okay, that's just an example. So Metatron, Mari de Godfe, is there. And when he arrived, I think we're talking about Rabbi Chia, when he arrives up there, he solemnly swore that he had heard from behind the curtain Me'acharea Pargoda. So he's telling people, I heard from heaven, that's the curtain, that the king remembers the doe who lies in the dust. This is Israel who's in exile, the world that is unredeemed, the world without God's presence, Shekhinah in exile. We're not just in exile. When we're in exile, God is in exile. The king, God, remembers that this world is in a state of exile, that the world is incomplete, and visits her every day. At that moment, he kicks the 399 heavens, firmaments. Note the gematria of Shamayim, heaven, is Shin Mem Yud Mem. So Mem Yud. So Mem is 40, Mem twice is 80, Yud 10 is 90, and Shin is 300. Shamayim is 390. So now we understand that Shamayim is the word for heaven because there are 390 heavens. I always thought there were 7 heavens, but in this version there are 390 heavens because the word Shamayim has the gematria of 390. So when this happens, he, God, kicks the 399 firmaments, which all tremble and quake before him. I think that's where we paused. The whole heavenly realm quakes when God visits. Miratatin vizain. Okay. Do a little more here, and then we'll kameh. The orid dimin alda, the nafel inun dimin retichin, ke'asha legoyama rabba. Mi inun dimin ka'im ahum mimana diyama vitkaim v'kadish me demak kadisha v'kabel alei, lemiv kol memoy dibresh v'yichnosh lu legave b'shaita diyakanshun kol ama maya al ama kadisha v'nagvon maya v'yavrun v'negivu. God sheds tears over this, the exile. God is crying. God is torn. God is crushed. He's bawling. And the whole universe is shaken. And those tears, what are they made of? God's tears are made not of water, but of bubbling fire. God is crying tears of wrath, of fire. And they fall into the ocean. And actually, this is the ocean. The ocean is, in this teaching, God's tears over the exile. So you can imagine, for the Zohar, they always studied outside, the mystics. You can imagine them at the ocean in Spain, at the Mediterranean, looking out and seeing not the ocean, but seeing the infinite vastness of the ocean and seeing God's tears. But in seeing God's tears, that's the way in which they're imagining. One way is a practice of tzipiti liyeshua, of hoping for the redemption, is that when you look at the world, it's bittersweet. It's beautiful, but the vastness of the ocean represents how sad it is that God's tears, that the world is so beautiful, and yet it's so unredeemed because there's exile, because we're not in a messianic state. From those tears, the prince of the ocean emerges. Well, who's the prince of the ocean? There are all these mythological figures here. So the prince of the ocean is Leviathan, the Leviathan, who will be the feast in the mythological idea for the Sadiqim in the world to come. Are people familiar with this midrashic tradition that in the world to come, in the Messianic era, Sadiqim will sit around and will eat the Leviathan? And what is the Leviathan? It's like a fish, a large whale-like thing, a sea creature. So here, actually, the Leviathan is a product. What causes it's more than just that Sadiqim will have a meal to eat. It's that Sadiqim are Sadiqim, enter heaven because they hope for redemption. And the Leviathan exists as a product of the ocean, and it evolves out of the ocean, which itself comes from God's tears over the sadness of the unredeemed world. And so the Leviathan is the meal that naturally emerges for people that hope for a redeemed world. That's what it is. There's an iPhone that entered the waiting room, but I don't know who that is since we're almost done, so I'm not going to admit them for the moment. Okay. By them he is sustained, and he hallows the name of the Holy King, agreeing to swallow up all the waters of creation and absorb them when all the nations gather against the holy people, so that the waters will dry up and they will pass through on dry land. So the waters now take on this other metaphor. If the waters are God's tears over the exile, the waters also represent the exile. And the exile it's not just our sins, it's the oppression of the Jewish people by other nations, right? Or it's the role of the world in causing the unredeemed state. And so the water becomes a symbol for the nations of the world, here viewed negatively, as preventing our redemption. And this draws an illusion. You know, the Zohar is big on illusions. So like Rabbi Chi and Rabbi Yossi fast for 40 days to see Moshe, and then they fast 40 days again when it doesn't work. Just like Moshe fasted for 40 days to get the luchos, but they broke. So he had to fast for 40 days again. And here, just like Yam Suf, the Sea of Reeds prevented our coming out of an unredeemed state and prevented us from having Torah and full revelation. It was in our way, and it was the Egyptians that chased us, but eventually God saved us from the Egyptians. Here, the nations of the world in this metaphor are like the ocean, and the ocean is like the Egyptians, and they're stopping us from crossing. You know, we would want to be redeemed, but at this point in exile, it's the nations of the world which continue to oppress us, which just keeps getting in the way. And so, you know, we see this and we're upset, and God sees this and we're upset. And in that meeting place is where tzidkos, his righteousness, emerges. But the waters, you know, eventually the Leviathan, it's such a big fish, it drinks it all. It drinks all the waters up. And it creates dry land for us to cross through and experience a second Egypt-like revelation. Does that make sense? So we can have Har Sinai again. We cross through the water, through the sea, because in this case, it's not the staff or it's not Nachshon jumping in. It's Leviathan drinking the waters of the ocean. That's the way this messianic story unfolds. Okay, so we're going to pause there for today. I think that's a fair amount of Chomer, unless, well, I'll open it up to you. We can either pause here, summarize, and reflect, or we could do the next little bit. I'm inclined to say the next little bit is about the Mashiach. I think it probably a good pause stop here. Does that sound all right for people?
It sounds like a good place to pause.
Yeah.
So just to summarize what we learned today, Rabbi Shimon dies. Rabbi Chia, Rabbi Yossi, other Chevrai are there. Rabbi Chia prostrates on the ground and has like an emotive outburst and says, gosh, ground, you swallow Rabbi Shimon. How could it be? He was such a holy light. But also Rabbi Shimon isn't going to really decay because Sadiqim live on. And then if Sadiqim live on, you know, like where do they live on? They live on in Gan Eden. And so Rabbi Chia tries to get to Gan Eden. And so he fasts to have a revelation like Moshe Rabbeinu. And here Rabbi Chia is like Moshe and Rabbi Shimon is like God. It's an interesting thing. But he fails. A voice tells him you didn't make it. So he tries again and he gets there and he's embarrassed and he has to stay low and he sees, what does he see? Just like Moshe Rabbeinu sees Akiva teaching his teachings and doesn't recognize them. Rabbi Shimon is studying Rabbi Yossi's teachings of Rabbi Shimon himself in Shemayim, and actually those teachings are causing him to soar. And so the teachings shine brilliant wings of angels and elevate them all up into this supernal realm. And he gets there, and finally they get this teaching about the exile, that every day, this is the whole introduction stories for this teaching from heaven. The teaching from heaven is that every day God mourns the exile and the state of the world, that the Shekhinah is unredeemed. And those that await this have a share in that world. And God has tears of fire which rain into the oceans and represent the vastness of God's pain. And people who are righteous, seeing this, share that pain. And Leviathan feeds off of the waters of the ocean, to become the feast for the righteous, and eventually Leviathan, in drinking these waters, eliminates the waters and allows the people to cross the sea, just like Egypt again, and be redeemed. And so it's not just Leviathan as a feast, it's Leviathan feeding off of the energy that comes from mourning the unredeemed state of the world. So this is a teaching and praise of sadness and optimism. In viewing the unredeemed state of the world and being sad about it and meeting God's tears about it, we actually create new possibilities. The very act of doing that dries up the waters and changes the reality. So the kind of spiritual version of this, just to kind of really make it sharp, is that in seeing the painful state of the world as it is, not as we wish it ought to be, but dealing with it. This is a good COVID teaching always, because the painful state of the world, not just Israel qua, the nations of the world, but just the whole thing, the whole mess of people and how great we think we are and what we really are, and all of it is kind of, you can't ignore it anymore. And just in meeting that reality, actually, and hoping for something better, not despair. And you can meet that and give up, but you can meet that and you want the Messiah. So in wanting the godly version of it, with holiness and God's revelation manifest in the world, that actually causes things to change, that feeling. There is a secular version of this. By secular, I mean a Talmudic version of this, which isn't mystical, that God is shoeg b'chol yom. The Gemara in Brachos says that God roars at the watches of the night and at midnight, and also when people see a Heshmei Rabba Mivarach Le'olam Maya, and that people should say that as loudly as possible, because God is roaring at that time. So there's this version in the Gemara in Brachos also where God is crying over the destruction of the temple on every day, and has a very emotive outburst there about his children who are in exile. And so this is kind of the mystical version of that consciousness of the exile actually, and the pain of it and wishing it otherwise, transforms it into something sweeter. It's mamtikas hadin. It changes a judgment to a righteous possibility. So that's what the Zohar is saying today, is this teaching from beyond, because it's hard to, why does it need to come from beyond? Because it's really hard to perceive that when you're in it. But from beyond, me'acharei prostor, it's an easier teaching to see from Shemayim, from heaven. One other point we missed is that Shemayim is Gematria 390, and when God does this every day for this moment, the whole universe shakes. All of the heavens are in an earthquake. Next time, Rabbi Shimon and the Messiah have a conversation. This is actually a little different than any of the Zohar we did last year. Am I right? The Zohar we did last year focused mainly on very esoteric teachings, and this is esoteric, but it's stories about these Tanaim and Chavraya. It's another major section of the Zohar. So we'll continue with this next time, and I'm grateful to have examined these texts with all of you. I know the Zohar can always be a little mystifying by definition, and so I'll say, as someone that keeps rereading and reading the passages over and over again, it's like an acquired taste, but it's a great taste to acquire. It's like the best wine, but at first it can be challenging to appreciate. I recall the first wine I had, and they said, why would anyone drink this? So the Zohar can be like that too, but it is really incredible. So thank you for joining, and until next week. Any questions?
Thank you for having us.
Oh, gosh. Is there anything better to do than study the Zohar? There is not.
Just a quick question. I don't know if there's anything to it, but we talked about the sea and it being the tears of God crying because of the exile. And then the Leviathan drinks the ocean, those tears. And then the tzaddikim eat the Leviathan. So is there something in terms of how that all processes, that the tzaddikim are somehow then making it possible to, it's the Leviathan who drinks all the water, but you know what I'm saying? Is there some symbolism to that they're eating the thing that, helped make the redemption possible?
Oh, right. Well, yeah. I mean, and so, right. What's the symbolism of the tzaddikim eating the Leviathan? I think, it's, well, I don't know. I mean, I'll open it up to the group. What's the symbol of the tzaddikim eating the
Good question. Good question, Martin.
I mean, right. Well, yeah, good questions are fine, but got to come up with an answer, or maybe not.
Well, no, so I mean, I think what it might be, right? I don't know if this is in the text or not, because it's not focused on the eating per se at this point. But I think, knowing that that's such a prominent place in Midrashic tradition, it's not a stretch to say that, that tzaddikim are, the old Hasidic teaching. I answer your thing with a story. The Baal Shem Tov taught is that the Hasidim always had like quips for things that in the Zohar are passages. So he taught. It says at the end of Shir Amalos, Hazorim b'dima berina yiksoru. Right, one who sows, who seeds in tears will reap joy. But so he taught Hazorim b'dima berina yiksoru. Those that seed tears joyfully will reap, as opposed to those that seed with tears will reap joy. Oh. Those that seed with sadness joyfully will reap. Yeah. So I think what this is right, the tzaddikim, what the tears are the pain, are the sins, are the exile, and they're eating that. So eating could be seen as like conquering it, like destroying it. But eating could be seen as, what is the act of eating if not for separating the nutrients and excreting the waste? So they are kind of doing a tikkun, in a sense, on everything that's happened, on all the negative, rather than just ignoring it, right? Part of the Messianic redemption is uplifting all of that, right? Using the negative as fuel and energy and nutrition for the future. So I think actually what they are doing is kind of, and that's what this teaching is about, right? It's about how in meeting God in this place of sadness, meeting the dough, of seeing how it is, that's what allows them to have a chelek in the world to come. So yeah, there's a part of, like, you have to kind of joyfully or culinarily, gastronomically, here, eating is like a joyful, people enjoy food. I enjoy food.
Eating usually is considered a joyful activity, right? Or should be.
Yes. Yeah. So it's one of the most enjoyable. So you're eating the sadness and you're eating the Spanish Inquisition, and you're eating the Holocaust, you're eating all of our sins, right? So in eating that, we're taking it in,
right?
Right? And we're transforming it into tikkun, into energy so we're really dealing with it. In fact, not just really dealing with it.
Well, it also becomes part of you, right? You are what you eat, right?
We're internalizing that and drawing what's positive from it. So in the same way that the Gemara in Yuma says that, gadol tshuva is so great because it turns donos, it turns intentional sins, even into zchuyos, into merits through repentance, right? There's like it's like the Museum of Failure is the actual secular version of this in Sweden and Los Angeles, 2 branches. It's a museum of entrepreneurial ideas that failed. Like that thought they were going to, that showed great promise, that like the Segway, that mainly were flops. And so, so you could look at that as or you could look at that as learning opportunity, right? Like what didn't work. So I think that this is that, right? What was painful, what was bad, and what do we learn from it? But really internalizing it by ingesting it, not just kind of arm's distance.
Right. Okay, that works for me.
That's off the cuff, but if you think of something.
Okay.
All right.
All right. Well, Shikoch, thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. And I'm excited to be back in session.
You'll let us know what time next week, right?
Yeah, I'm going to pull some of the others and see what schedule time works. It's either going to be 12 or 2.
Yeah, okay. That's fine.
Okay.
Great. Thank you so much, both.
Thank you.
All right.